I'm Tom Crosbie. I'm an associate professor of military studies at the Royal Danish Defence College and an editor of the Scandinavian Journal of Military Studies. Welcome to 15 Minutes with our guest, Professor Christopher Coker. Professor Coker is a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics, and he is the director of LSE's Ideas think tank. And the reason Professor Coker is joining us today is to talk about an article that was published with us at SJMS a couple of years ago called Artificial Intelligence and the Future of War. So with that, I just want to jump right into it, Professor Coker, and ask you a little bit about this article that we here at the Defense College have really admired and discussed since it's come out. There is one line in the article that really stuck with me. You say, AI is not going to change war for some time yet. So that was published again in 2019. Since the article has come out, we've seen, rapid developments in global conflict, and most probably relevant is the Kurgu 2 rotary wing drone, which was used in combat in Libya for the first time. And again, that happened since your article came out. So I'm just curious about your reflections since the article. Do you stand by your claim that AI has not changed war yet? Are you revising your opinion? What's your perspective?
Yes, I would stick with this claim. I mean, it's quite clear that artificial intelligence will allow very fast information processing, target identification, better consequence management, therefore being able to anticipate the consequences of one's own actions. You could say in some senses that machines would be better suited to the stresses and pressures of modern war than human beings are. But I think they are going to be limited by the limits of autonomy. And we mustn't be misled by science fiction into thinking that autonomous systems for some time yet are going to be able to replicate what we can do. There are 3 points that I would make here, 3 features that I would draw your attention to. One is that machines can indeed copy us. They're very good at what's called inverse reinforcement learning, and AI will be better at improving their performance and doing things better than we can. But they won't be able to actually understand what is the right thing to do in a particular situation. And this is why we're concerned about them. So is the committee against killer robots. And we can see this already in the United States, where judges rely on sentencing on computer algorithms, and they tend to sentence African Americans more severely simply because there are more African Americans in jail. So concepts of fairness, equity, and justice are well beyond them. And the second problem is that they don't have any volitional intelligence, which means that they can't actually do anything outside the scope of their program, whereas we can reprogram ourselves constantly. We do this in warfare when we realize that the plan we had hoped to execute is not going right. So again, I think that is a problem they have. And the third is that it looks to us, to scientists, I think the social intelligence is very largely networked through social interaction. So they will have to act increasingly in combination with ourselves. There will have to be team players, members of a team. And that, I think, is going to be the real difference. But in that team, the senior partner will continue to remain human beings for some time yet.
Okay, so it's that team element, maybe more than the other two, the path dependency, the reprogramming qualities that are kind of the limit case maybe in this becoming something really unrecognizable as war as we've known it. Is that how you see it?
That's right. Yeah.
So is this connecting to the Clausewitzian arguments about the nature and character of war? Do you see this linked in there?
Yes, very much so. I think Clausewitz is useful in this respect. The first Pentagon report on artificial intelligence that came out in 2019, when I wrote the article, in fact, said that AI will change the nature of warfare. And you often hear, particularly American specialists, talking about this in a very loose and casual fashion. But as Clausewitz tells us, there's a huge difference between the nature of war and the character of war. And the character of war is really just its historical evolution, but it's also the fact that it is absolutely germane to our humanity. So we're the only, I would say, species on the planet that practices war. You could argue ants do, but ants don't have politics. They don't have leaders. They don't have central commands. They don't have concepts of sacrifice. They don't have those existential elements that make war into what Thucydides, another great writer, of course, called it, the human thing. So I think if you want to understand why the nature of war won't change, you have to understand why we human beings will continue to prosecute. It's found partly in our biology, our competitive nature. It's found also in culture, the fact that we play war games, we go to war movies. This fuels our interest in war. And of course, it taps into our pathologies, the good pathologies that lead to heroism, emulation of the great heroes of the past, fictional and non-fictional, and the bad pathologies, psychoses and pathologies that come out, of course, in war. So I think in that respect, what you see here is that the nature of war isn't going to change. Martin van Krefel wrote a book called Technology in War in 1991, in which he said technology doesn't change three things. It doesn't change the fact that war is an affair of the heart. It's fueled by human passions. It's politics. It's entirely about politics. No machine that we have invented yet does politics. It would even understand what politics actually was. But above all, machines are repetitive. They go in for serialization. They go in for efficiency. They are linear. War is non-linear because human beings practice it, and human beings are more unpredictable in their behavior than any other species. So for all those reasons, the nature of war is not going to change.
Those are fascinating points to thinking about war in this kind of deeper human characteristic sense, that this is something that we just characteristically do, that describes and defines us as a species. Certainly puts any type of AI system that is not indistinguishable from a human somehow on the outside of that, almost by definition. And so I guess what we'd be looking for to identify a transition point will be the Turing test kind of level of AI, where we can no longer distinguish AI from human cognition, I suppose.
That would certainly be the case, but I would go further than that and say that we really, again, I go back to my first point about automation. We are products of, we're not products of intelligent design, we're products of natural selection. But we are creating intelligent design. We're creating machines that will learn, machines that will be engaged in evolutionary engineering so that they'll be able to re-engineer themselves. They'll be able, probably at some point in time, to reprogram themselves. In other words, we are creating something which is historically new when it comes to history and the character of war, automated evolution. And the moment that we apply automated evolution to war, we will have taken a back seat to some extent. And at that point, war will still be the human thing, but we humans will be different from the humans who've practiced it before. We talk about the post-human condition. We could go on about cyborgs as well. We can talk about that on another occasion, perhaps. But that is a long way in the future.
One of the points I really admire in the article was the fine line you draw between the kind of language of a dystopian future, a nightmarish scenario where technologies run rampant, and the converse of that, which we simply don't seem to talk about or think about much, which is where technology makes us more humane and makes our capacity for war less devastating. I'm curious if you've reflected upon that in the time since you wrote this article, or if you see places where we can unlock more of this potential, particularly with the use of artificial intelligence.
Well, of course, technologies change our behavior, so they change us, and that's very important. And we were concerned about that with drones. If you remember 20 years ago, we thought that drone pilots would see war as a computer game, and many of them played 60 hours a week computer games. We used terms like dissociation. They would be dissociated from their actions. We used terms like moral de-skilling. They wouldn't understand. They'd have no empathy. They wouldn't understand the impact of their actions. We were concerned, neuroscientists were concerned, that the brain would change as well, because the brain protects us from information overload by shutting down reflection. We were concerned that spending all those hours on screen would weaken what's called deep processing that underpins empathy. Now, none of these things actually happen to be true. Drone pilots don't see war as a kill box. They suffer from very high rates of post-traumatic stress. It's one of the reasons why the US Air Force has difficulty recruiting them now. So that's a good thing. But what your question actually suggests is that we can go further than that into a moral upgrade, and that basically machines will enable us to observe the laws of war or the Geneva Conventions perhaps more strictly and faithfully than we actually do. And of course, since 2007, Ronald Arkin in the United States has been trying to build an ethical governor, a conscience into a machine, and so far failed. But I think those attempts will continue because this is the next upgrade. We've had physical upgrading in war from the time we've done throwing stones at each other to the day that we'll soon have Tony Stark's exoskeleton, which is under development by the US Navy. We've got cerebral improvement in performance from use of ballistics by the Greeks to multitasking by drone pilots now. And we may well have a moral upgrade. And why would we want that? Simply, I think, because robots are better at goal fulfillment. They do what they are programmed to do every time. So it's not a question that they would be more compassionate or more reasonable, but we couldn't scare them into acting badly or bribe them into behaving badly or appeal to their better nature. Or open them to moral argument. We couldn't actually reason them out of doing anything. And that, of course, is what makes robots so frightening for the International Red Cross and others who oppose the arming of them.
Actually, that reminds me of something I was reading recently by Judith Shklar, S-H-K-L-A-R, the American philosopher who worked at Harvard for a long time, and wrote a lot about the concept of obedience and the kind of the small group dynamic that enforces that obedience and facilitates our decision-making about whether to follow unjust orders or to reject those orders, and how difficult it is for humans to make that decision. And in a sense, it's very easy, perhaps, for this type of artificial intelligence to make these decisions, but it could be, highly problematic, I think you're getting at. That leads me to the question of fiction. You mentioned several different creative writers so far in our 10 minutes we've been talking. What brings you to fiction? This is one of the things that's distinctive about your career, that you've really sincerely engaged with creative writing. What does that give us as a research community?
Well, I could talk about fiction in general because I wrote a book about this, From the Iliad to Catch-22. But let me just say something about science fiction, because I think this is what we use now more and more. I mean, it's stock reading on syllabuses in American military colleges. Ender's Game, for example, is on the syllabus of the Marine Corps University. Project Cassandra in Germany is a collaboration between the German military and the literature department at the University of Tübingen to come up with scenarios which you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. The Defense Innovation Agency in France has commissioned a set of science fiction writers to come up with scenarios for the future. So why do we use science fiction? Because it's a tool of the industrial age. It's only been there since the 1850s. It's largely about technology. And sometimes science fiction writers anticipate the future. My favorite example is H.G. Wells, who wrote a book about an atomic war in 1914 called The World Set Free, 19 years before the first scientist, Leo Szilard, imagined an atomic war would actually be possible. So just imagine that if in 1914, everyone had thought that an atomic war might be possible, we might well have fought the Second World War with atomic weapons. The thing is to be sure that science fiction doesn't phase into science fantasy. And this is where people like Michio Kaku and others will tell you that you've got to deal with different ranges of impossibilities, things that are impossible now, things that are impossible but allowed by the physics, and things that physics doesn't allow. So a case in point would be an article I read recently about a minority report invention. It's an American system that allows the US Navy to anticipate when a ship is about to leave port and where it's going. Minority Report was, of course, Philip Dick's story that was turned into a film, and it's about precognition, your ability to actually predict the future. This system is not about predicting the future. It's just about using cloud computing and artificial intelligence and sensors to anticipate, hopefully correctly, what your enemy is doing next. Precognition is impossible. So that is where I think fiction is quite useful. It keeps you rooted to the ground.
Mm-hmm. Just my last question, which I think ties into what you just brought up, the use of fiction in military education. These questions about artificial intelligence, the future of war, that requires an understanding of brain science and all sorts of very difficult, challenging fields. I'm trying to find what is the place of people in uniform within this debate. Are these fundamentally civilian-led discussions? Are these questions that we as a research community should be taking the leadership role in? Is this something that you think those in uniform should be engaging with? Just curious about that, because I'm, after all, an educator of officers.
Well, I remember going to a conference on robotics in Dubai some years ago, and there was a session on ethics. And the only people who came to the session were military officers. Hardly anybody from the private sector did. And that, I think, is extremely important, because the private sector, of course, is going to be really pushing the AI agenda far more than governments. They can spend more money than governments can. They're more inventive and innovative, etc. The ethics, if ethics is important, it's people in uniform who will be asking the ethical questions, because at the end of the day, they have to answer for their actions. The private contractors can always shrug their shoulders and find another company or another government to work for. And we face these problems everywhere. We face them in cyberspace. We've been trying to produce a code of conduct. NATO, the cyber school in Estonia, has been trying to do that, so far failed. In space, the latest, I think, the new domain of warfare, where the Outer Space Treaty is defunct, and we still don't have treaties which govern our behavior in space. And with robotics, it's too late for Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, I'm afraid, because he never imagined that we might actually program robots to kill human beings. It's very difficult for general purpose morality, because we don't know whether we're supposed to put in the 10 Commandments, programming the 10 Commandments, or perhaps Kantian ideas of second categorical imperatives, or just purely utilitarian ideas, such as the trolley problem. Do you push the fat man off the bridge in order to bring the train to a halt? These are questions which Google is now actually actively engaged in discussing with its driverless cars. But the point is, the questions are going to be raised by the military and not by the private sector. But of course, working with the private sector is how we will develop AI in the future.
Well said, and that's a great point for us to end on, I think, just to remind us of the importance of military education and of the field of military studies to challenge our thinking on these very important developments in the world stage. So this has been 15 minutes with our guest, Professor Christopher Coker. I just want to thank you, sir, and thank you to those who've watched this.
Thank you.